Hi, I'm Bailey Cashman, and this is my major project on the anti-war film as an impossible genre. So, before I begin, if you notice in the top left corner, I'll be using a footnote system for my referencing, or I guess in this case, endnotes rather, that I'll show at the end of the slideshow. So, what are war films? They're a genre of film typically connected with war, where combat is central to the plot and the story. And in this case, they're typically associated with modern eras, the 20th and 21st century. That is, the films I will be examining today are modern war films, though medieval war films still will relate to these points. Some common themes you might expect: combat, survival, escape, camaraderie, and sacrifice, but what exactly makes war films so interesting? Well, the genre is so divisive because of how they choose to reflect the nature of warfare. That is, war films portray narratives that are some of the most powerful and raw human experiences, and war films are inherently political because not only are they already art, but they shape the narrative of warfare, one of the most politically volatile subjects. And we see in this that war films fill all different sorts of roles with unique narratives. You might think of a film like a patriotic film like Top Gun or this tragedy of Grave of the Fireflies. That is, these war films range from these subgenres of pro war to anti war. So, what exactly are these subgenres? Let's just break that down real quick. So, with pro war films, they tend to celebrate ideas of successful military action and camaraderie and heroic stories, and specifically good against evil narratives, all captured in exciting battle sequences. Films you may think of include Top Gun or American Sniper. While on the other hand, anti war films tend to demonstrate, such as the consequences for civilians and soldiers and the psychological and physical hardship of that. They also show the impact on society and humanity, and depending on the film, they usually portray this in different ways, either through a satirical nature with the absurdity of war, or this intense realism to show the futility. Films you might think of are Doctor Strangelove or Awkward on the Western Front. However, it's really important to be clear, there's never a clear categorization here, even in the films I've just listed, but imagine Saving Private Ryan. That film can slot into many of these different subjects. It can fit into all of them, and that itself is a problem. War films are problematic because there's no clear consensus on how they convey war, that the very nature of anti-war films is ironic, and so critics have long held an argument about how anti-war narratives fit into cinema. And the one I'm going to pick today is in 1957, a critic and filmmaker, Francois Truffaut, he would say there is no such thing as an anti war film. And this would popularize an argument that exists all the way through to modern cinema. So, who was Francois Truffaut? He's now deceased, but he lived from 1932 and 1985 and was very active in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He was a French filmmaker, actor, and critic, and a prominent founder of the French New Wave cinema and a voice in the film space industry. So, what did Truffaut mean by this? What did he mean by there is no such thing as an anti war film? I think what Truffaut was implying is that war films themselves inevitably end up glorifying the conflict. That their portrayal of the thrill of combat or the camaraderie of soldiers, among other things, that is the problem. He thinks that to show something is to ennoble it. To show violence is to ennoble it and fail its anti-war narrative. What Truffaut is really implying is that anti-war narratives are impossible within cinema. That the medium always glorifies warfare, undermining the theme of anti-war films. So that leads into these ideas about the limitations of the medium, that this critique is a direct consequence of the medium of cinema. And what Truffaut is really claiming is that it's impossible to convey anti-war narratives in cinema just due to its form. It's fundamentally a recreation. It can never be the real thing, and it's impossible to create anything as confronting as the real thing. And it's important to clarify that Truffaut is not saying that the medium turns away ideas of anti-war films and doesn't portray them because it confronts profit and entertainment. Rather, it's impossible to create anything similar. Not that it isn't done, but it can't be done. Of course, Truffaut is an important opinion, but I want to look at some other perspectives too to just gauge this general consensus. And that is, I want to look at Steven Spielberg, a incredibly famous filmmaker and the director of Saving Private Ryan, one of the most iconic and famous war movies of all time. He said in regards to this film that, of course, every war movie, good or bad, is an anti-war movie. And what Spielberg is getting at here is that the idea of war itself, the depiction of war itself, is always going to promote anti-war ideas. And this is confusing, really, because Spielberg's stance here is an exact inversion of Truffaut's stance. But not all directors think the same way. Samuel Fuller here, the director and creator of The Big Red One and The Steel Helmet, an older generation of war films, he once said, and I'm going to paraphrase roughly here, that the only way to make a realistic anti-war film was to have soldiers fire their guns into the audience, killing and injuring people in the cinema. Fuller is arguing that only real violence could allow audiences to comprehend real warfare. And Fuller is aligning with Truffaut here by placing this radical solution in order to argue the very impossibility of the anti-war film's nature. So, how do we look at this? These opinions are diverse. There's no single moral judgment that everyone follows, but I believe I can provide a general consensus or a conclusion to this argument by demonstrating some of the mythologies of violence in film, by looking at some of the most iconic war films of our time in order to understand what defines the pieces of an anti-war film. So, let's take a look into some war films. The first film I want to look at is a film called Paths of Glory, a film by famous director Stanley Kubrick, released in 1957 and classified as an anti-war film. This film is so important because it's the one that started this long-standing debate. It's the most contextually relevant example, as Truffaut was watching this when he made his claim. We can see what he was looking at to get his thoughts. And to really break this down, I want to look at perhaps the most iconic scene in this movie. It's a trench rush scene. It's the classic trope of soldiers in World War I charging over the top of their trench, their certain death. And it's this great spectacle action set piece. There's these explosions, these hundreds of people, this massive scale, this large budget, and all backed together by this innovative filmmaking. We have these cameras panning across, these tracking shots, close-ups, and the actual context of the scene. We see these, it's bravery, it's her heroism, it's these soldiers charging towards their death against these immeasurable odds. They can't succeed. But ironically, there's no visual consequences to that in the story. If you look through this scene, you don't see soldiers getting killed, you don't see them falling over even, or you don't see violence, you don't see anything, and there's this lack of violent impact. And that's, I think, directly due to the technical limitations of this era. There's no CGI, and photo editing tools were incredibly limited. This is a scene that couldn't be altered. And because of that, we're so distant from the soldiers. There's no consequences. Is this even an anti-war scene anymore? So, I'd argue that these critiques, Truffaut's critiques, are far more obvious when viewed in the context of this particular film, from these technological limitations in the time before CGI to making the film not depict violence really at all. There's no gore or blood, and even if it is there, it's extremely minimal. But there's still this fundamentally powerful anti-war narrative that holds the film together. So how do you put those two together? Well, I think that Truffaut's critiques are more obvious viewed in the context of this film, where this violence is far less impactful, and we have these massive action set pieces that don't really have consequences, that make it difficult and undermine the powerful anti-war elements, removing their impact. I feel we can better understand Paths of Glory by looking at Full Metal Jacket, another film by the same director, Stanley Kubrick, made 30 years after its predecessor. It's in an era that was far more advanced with cinema technologies that allowed CGI and allowed these practical effects to happen. And at a time when culture had changed around what could be shown in cinema. And to do that, I want to look at one scene here. A scene, there's this culmination of Act 1, where we see this intense violence. From this all leads from a confronting military mental health, where military culture breaks down people and through hazing and isolation, encourages suicide and fragging. And we see Private Powell confront his commanding officers here. But unlike Paths of Glory, we see true violence. We see this blood splatter, this or maybe even over-the-top effect, this complete opposite of Paths of Glory. And if we skip later onto the scene, the culmination of the scene, where Private Powell takes his own life, there's this intensity, this suicide, this intense gore where nothing is hidden away. It's all center in the middle of the shot. A complete difference to Path of Glory. So how should we think about this? I mean, this film is ironically still contentious, even though you can see that intense violence. And I think that's because violence can be misinterpreted completely. And I picked out an interview from Anthony Swofford, a former US Marine and now writer. He talks about his experience in the military as a teenager, where he viewed Private Powell's act of murder and suicide as a result of his own ineptitude. Not that it was a military culture breaking down his mental health, but his lack of skill. And he talks about how he viewed drill instructors in the military were imitating the drill instructor from Full Metal Jacket. Even though the drill instructor is supposed to be this character of evil, he's the one that breaks down soldiers and encourages them to kill themselves almost. He's this evil incarnate. Yet, it was people in real life who misunderstood the meaning of this film and this critique of military culture and began to imitate these drill instructors and bring them into real life. So, I'd argue that Truffaut's critiques are obvious when viewed in this film too, even though violence is front and centre and impactful, that when it even is there, it's misinterpreted and used incorrectly to further fuel the idea that anti-war films can be failures. So now I've seen how violence has evolved and grown more intense, but that still doesn't fix the issue of failed anti-war films. So now I want to look at Apocalypse Now, a film that released in 1979 by famous director Francis Ford Coppola, a critically acclaimed masterpiece that has been regarded for generations. Where this film has intense violence too, but it depicts it in a different way, with undertones of absurdity. And the scene I want to look at here is a prominent scene in the film where we see helicopters in the US military raid a village in Vietnam, suspected of hiding Viet Cong people. And I want you to think about all the heroic components of this. I have all the audio off, but the Ride of the Valkyries is playing this orchestral suite that's heroic and epic. And this editing with these rapid cuts and these fast movement and this helicopters, explosions, shooting, these soldiers and camaraderie. But all that heroicism is contrasted by this sheer absurdity, that the commander's like drinking coffee while flying his helicopter, that they're surfing in the destroyed village, but they're doing this while killing civilians. These people aren't fighting back. They're running for their lives. These people are laughing while they kill them. There's this purposeless brutality to satirize the Vietnamese War and the joke of how US Marines were handling the war. So this violence is far more impactful. It feels awful to see these civilians get killed. But how are you interpreting this on your perspective? Are you a US Marine who hated the Vietnam War and thinks this is disgusting? Or are you on the other way thinking that the Viet Cong deserve this? It's still interpretative. And that's when I get out again. It's this ambivalence, this idea that these anti-war narratives can be misconstrued and interpreted in the wrong way. Anthony Swofford, again, he's such a valuable source on this. He talks about his experience in the military again, where he watched this film before being sent to the war in Iraq in 1990 in order to get his platoon excited for the war. It was almost being used as a propaganda film, even though it's everything but that. So yes, I'd argue that Truffaut's critiques are more obvious, that regardless of the depiction of violence and even in the absurdity of it, it can still be misinterpreted by the perspectives that view it. So now I want to provide a counterpoint to all this, a film that's entirely different from everything we've seen, an animated film from a Japanese perspective, something that couldn't be more different from the live action productions we've seen. And I want to think about how this film uses perspective, and specifically its abstraction from war. That is, the main characters don't feature in the war. We don't really see direct combat at all. It's only the war on civilians. And that is, war is absent in the story. It's only used to drive the plot forward and not used as a tool of entertainment. It removes the combat to focus on the tragedy of its after effects, of how it hurts civilians and breaks down societies. And even in its form of animation, presenting new possibilities that violence isn't constrained by these physical limitations of CG or tools or makeup. It's rather animated and there's real brutality shown. And this idea that violence can't be ennobled here because it isn't present. By abstracting ourselves from the war, from this point of a soldier to a civilian, we break away Truffaut's primary criticism. However, though, this can't be a universal solution, because you can't have war movies without war. War movies need to be from the perspective of soldiers, and that's what people find entertaining in most films. So, back to Truffaut. Is he correct? I mean, yes and no. There's 4 types of violence I've covered here, where we see Paths of Glory and its contextual limitations that fail to capture the horrors and violence undermining its anti-war narrative. To Full Metal Jacket, there's evolution, now we have intense violence and this psychological trauma, but it's still misinterpreted and used incorrectly. And then even in Apocalypse Now, a different way, a stylistic violence, by portraying this absurdity, this ridiculousness of the Vietnam War, still being misinterpreted. But then, Grave of the Fireflies, this film that has this forced perspective through abstraction to finally amplify and negate these layers of interpretation. So, is he correct? We've seen that techniques can be used to manipulate themes and make them more likely to be interpreted in a specific way. But the problem is, these themes can never be universally received, because films are fundamentally art. They're political, they can be viewed by however they want, where the intention of the creator doesn't certify its meaning. And that's the very problem. The nature of anti and pro is ambivalent in film. While sure, I've covered a negative depiction of these films, there's dozens of other examples that are either negative or positive. Films are interpreted in a multitude of ways. And what that gets at is these anti-war themes exist, but a true anti-war film doesn't exist. A film that has no room for interpretation, that punches you in the gut with its anti-war narrative, that doesn't exist, because films are interpretive, they are art. So then, what's the future to all this? Well, I think the sad and fundamental truth is that the effects of pro-war motifs are far more obvious than their anti-war counterparts, inciting military enlistment and supporting operations. So then, is there an answer? What would be a true anti-war film? Well, I think the only solution is real footage, and that is just a documentary. And then people might ask, do we even need war films? And maybe the answer is yes or no. But I fundamentally believe that we need war films. For all the bad they do in society, there's all the better they can do. Even though they can't capture the horrors of war, they present a facsimile, the closest thing we've got to recreating war. They are a lesson for this generation, generations who haven't lived in war, who haven't seen the horrors quite as closely. They are a lesson for the future, and hopefully they can better society, because they are a cornerstone of the industry, and also a cornerstone of history itself. Well, thank you so much for listening. I was deeply passionate about this topic, and here are my references.